So I just kind of want to go back and review from algebra. If you had a quadratic function, ax squared plus bx plus c, and we wanted to factor this. If a, the coefficient in front of x squared is 1, that makes our life so much easier. That's where you're just trying to find the two numbers that multiply to give you that constant c and add to give you that middle term b. If a is not 1, a can't be 0, because that would mean that it's not quadratic, it would end up being linear. But if a is not 1, there's a trick that you can do to see if it's factorable. And if it's factorable, then you can use this trick to factor. And so what you want to do is you want to look at your coefficient in front of the x squared and your constant, and you want to multiply those together. And this is, I think, is called the AC method. So you're going to first find what a times c is. And then you're looking for two numbers that would give us that multiple, that multiply to AC, and add to give us that middle term. Add to give us this. Once we find those two numbers, if you can find those two numbers, it's factorable. If you can't find those two numbers, then it's not factorable or it's hard to see, and I would just jump into the quadratic formula. If you can find those two numbers, so if you're finding the two numbers that work, you're going to rewrite your middle term with the sum of those two numbers. So usually when I'm factoring, I look at how many terms what I'm trying to factor has. When I rewrite this middle term, bx, as a sum of two terms with x, that sum to give me b, but with those two terms would multiply to give me this multiple of AC. And then I have this 4 terms polynomial. And when you have 4 terms, one way to try factoring is factoring by grouping, and that's what you're going to be doing. So once you rewrote the middle term with those two numbers you found, then you're going to factor by grouping. Okay. Let's look at one real quick. Okay, so let's look at a quick example of factoring using this rule. So let's say we have f of x is equal to 2x squared plus 9x minus 5, and we want to factor f of x. So first thing that we're going to do is we're going to look at a times c. So my a value is 2 times my c value, my constant, and carry the coefficient in front. So this would be negative 5. So a times c, 2 times negative 5 is negative 10. So we're looking for two things that multiply to give me negative 10 and would add to give me my middle term. And my middle term in this case is 9. So multiplying, giving me a negative number, I know one is positive, one is negative. And I'm summing, and my sum is positive. So I know that the larger number is going to be positive, and the littler number would be negative. Well, if I went through multiples just of 10, 1 times 10. So if one of those was positive, one of those was negative, so negative 1 and positive 10, that multiplies to negative 10, and that would sum negative 1 plus positive 10 is 9. That sums to my middle coefficient, 9. And so we're going to take this middle term and we're going to use these two numbers to rewrite it in the equivalent form. So doing that, we would have f of x is equal to 2x squared. So instead of 9x, I'm going to write it as, I can write it as 10x there. plus 10x minus 1x. So that's the same thing we have above. It's just written differently. And then we have the minus this 5. So once you found those two numbers, you rewrote your middle term using those two numbers. And then the next step is factoring by grouping. So you want to look at the first two terms, and we want to look at the last two terms. And we're going to pull out what we have in common in the first two terms, and we're going to pull out what we have in common in the last two terms. And once we do that, we should have the same thing inside the parentheses. So if I look at 2x squared and a 10x, well, 2 and 10 both have a 2 in common, so I can factor out a 2 there. And an x squared and an x both have a single x in common. So pulling out a 2x from those first two terms, you're left with a x plus 5. Notice negative x minus 5. It's almost identical to what we have here, x plus 5, but we're off by a negative sign. So we need to pull a -1 out of those last two terms. I'm just going to write it as -1 in front. Normally you don't see that 1 in front, but I think that helps students when they're rewriting it. So this would be x plus 5. So if it was factorable and you chose the right thing and you pulled out the right thing over here, you should have the same thing inside your parentheses. If not, then maybe look at it to see, can I manipulate it to be the same? Did I not factor correctly? And because I can pull out the parentheses, so I'm pulling out x plus 5 from both of those groupings. So if I pull out x plus 5 from this first piece, what you're left with is just the 2x. And if I pull out the 2x plus 5 from the second piece, what we're left with is this -1. So that was factorable, and we used what I call is the AC method to factor that.